From Los Angeles, Spotify is up to something. The latest from Podnews.net with the Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in London this May. Spotify is working on a brand new podcast interface, spotted by Chris Messina, who posted a screen recording archived by Podnews in our show notes and our newsletter today at podnews.net. The new interface adds a dedicated podcasts tab, vertical scrolling and live captions for all shows. Messina is running a pre-release version of Spotify, and it's unclear when this will be released, if at all. #exciting. A much previewed talk at Podcast Movement Evolutions by YouTube's new director of podcasting, Kai Chuck, didn't contain any new announcements. He did promise that, quote, over the next few months you'll hear some announcements from us as to how we plan to continue supporting the podcast ecosystem, but that was about as far as we got. The Podcast Movement team has posted a video look at Podcast Movement Evolutions. I'm there, 38 seconds in, just before Will Ferrell and Paris Hilton, just saying. The Ossa Collective hosted its first ever production camp last week to support development of sponsored podcasts. 60 guests attended presentations and a reception in Santa Monica in California. Podcast promotions expert Podspike is to run a podcast clinic live at the Podcast Show in 2022. Podcasters can make in-person appointments on their website. The Netflix series Archive 81 has been cancelled after its first season. The show was based on the supernatural horror podcast Archive 81 from Dead Signals. Krista Tippett's On Being is to stop being aired on NPR stations from June. Tippett will continue producing the show on a seasonal basis. It was one of the first NPR shows to also become a podcast and claims more than 375 million downloads. Amazon Music and Wondery have closed a deal with Odyssey's Pineapple Street Studios. The podcast production company will produce at least 4 new shows. It comes hot on the heels of 9/12, winning 3 awards, including Podcast of the Year at the Ambies. Andrew Neil, a British journalist and publisher, is to make his first podcast series. The backstory will be produced by Tortoise and will launch in Q2. The Pod LP tab has a new release for iOS, adding a season filter, just like Apple, and configuration improvements too. And if you want to get your podcast heard in China, then you can. On an app which translated means small universe in English. You'll find details in our show notes and our newsletter today. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. Dave Jones from the Podcast Index has posted about WebSub and why it doesn't scale well. The Podcast Index is using a system called Podping, which it prefers. And there's been an update to the Social Interact tag, which is in the consideration phase. The root comment URI has been moved into an attribute. Podnews' RSS feed has been updated, and we permanently use Twitter as our base commenting tool, and we'll add lightning comments back shortly. And in podcast news, Radio Lento, a podcast containing soundscapes recorded in binaural sound, is to be preserved by the British Library. And in Podland news this week, recorded at Podcast Movement Evolutions, you'll hear special guest Alban Brooke of Buzzsprout. Sam, James, that's me, and Alban talk about the conference, YouTube's, quote, big announcement, and much more. And this podcast is brought to you by The Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in London this May. It's a 2-day business event with 100 speakers announced already and another 150 to go. There's all kinds of people there, including Marvin Harrison from the beloved agency, Jen Sargent from Wondery, Fern Cotton, Ross Adams, and many more. You can get 20% off day passes with the code PODNEWS at thepodcastshowlondon.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories in full and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.